I'm Michelle Kelly, editor of Cottage Life Magazine. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Cottage Life Podcast. In this episode, we speak with graphic novelist and writer David Robertson about appreciating rather than appropriating First Nations culture. Also, we take a magical winter walk in the woods, and we offer an easy cure for a creepy cottage problem: what to do when leeches find you in the water. This is the Cottage Life Podcast, where every day is the weekend.
Hey, cottage coach Adam Holman here. If you know me, you know I spend a lot of time outdoors. Whether I'm camping with my family or fishing in my top secret spot, there's nowhere I'd rather be than in the wild. But we all have to head home at some point, and I'm pretty sure that the mosquitoes have put a homing device on me, because sometimes they can be just as annoying in my backyard. So, when I'm back in the city, I use the backyard mosquito lamp from Off. Whether I'm barbecuing my breakfast or having a backyard dinner with my family, I know I'll be safe from mosquitoes for up to 6 hours. Which means I may never have to go inside again.
David Robertson is a Winnipeg-based award-winning graphic novelist and writer. He's also a member of Norway House Cree Nation. In our recent June-July issue of Cottage Life, David wrote a thought-provoking essay on a topic that's on the mind of many cottagers these days: the difference between appreciating versus appropriating First Nations culture. Is it okay to put in a nukshuk on your shoreline? What about a totem pole on your property? I spoke to David to help us better understand how to navigate some of our nervousness about these complex issues. I should let you know that the interview took place before the news broke about the discovery of unmarked graves of Indigenous children who attended residential school across Canada. While we don't directly address these discoveries and their massive ramifications in this conversation, it's clear that understanding and appreciating First Nations culture has never been more urgent. With that in mind, here is our conversation. Thanks for joining me on the podcast, David.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I did want to start by asking you, and this is kind of the heart of your piece in the magazine, what is the difference, if you can sum it up, between appropriation and appreciation?
Right. So appropriation is when we borrow elements from another culture. And typically it's like a dominant culture borrowing elements from a marginalized culture. So like, a non-Indigenous community, for example, or person borrowing elements from an Indigenous culture. And then I think the other part of it is that you're not only borrowing from that culture, but you're also using it for some kind of gain, whether it's a monetary gain or even personal attention. Those elements all need to be in place for something to be an act of appropriation. So it could even be just, posting on social media something without permission, like someone in regalia, for example, without giving credit or without any context, and just because you want to get likes or something like that. Right. That's something that's an appropriative act. The appreciation is really when we look at these cultures and the things that we're doing, and we are seeking to understand it, where we know that what we are displaying, for example, is something that belongs to the history and traditions of another culture, and we do the work to understand the roots of it, where it's from, what it means, and then we are able to articulate that to somebody else so that we can explain what it is. And it's kind of at some points it can be a little bit of a tricky line, but I think it is that thought. It's I think that I need to learn about this, and then actually just doing the research to understand it.
Okay, so let me put that idea in practice. So, say I go to a powwow in cottage country, which there are quite a few,
Mm.
and then I take photos and I post on social media. Is that appropriation or is that appreciation? That's a tough one for me.
Yeah, I think that for me, if I were to see that, and there was no context to it, so you have the opportunity on social media to write some sort of description, and if you're posting a picture like that from a powwow that you've attended, and you're explaining the significance of the powwow, you're explaining, where you were, what it's about, even the specific regalia or dance that you're showing, um, then I think that kind of gets you out of kind of a problematic area,
Mm-hmm.
and also where you can. And this is the other important part: is seeking permission. So
Right.
you're asking permission to post the picture and then giving credit. And that's something that I think is also very important, and it can kind of cross you over either line of appreciation or appropriation.
Right. I guess even asking to take the picture in the first place.
Yeah, that wouldn't be, it wouldn't be a tough thing to do, or
No.
a wrong, it wouldn't be wrong to do that. I think that actually would be, really appreciated. And the thing is with, like, with Indigenous people, and not to, again, I guess not to blanket all into one group, because there's many different and distinct Indigenous cultures across Canada. But
Exactly.
Indigenous peoples are very understanding, very welcoming, very warm, and willing, and actually oftentimes excited to be able to talk about these things, to talk about their culture, to talk about their language, to talk about their traditions, because we understand the importance of sharing this knowledge, so
Yep.
that people understand, because a lot of the problems that we've seen historically in Canada is because there hasn't been an understanding. There's been assumptions, that have led to really kind of difficult times in our history.
Yes.
So we really appreciate that, and so I think there's sometimes a nervousness that people have. You don't need to have that nervousness. I think that it's we understand people make mistakes, and um, I don't think anybody I know would ever guilt anybody for making a mistake either. And
Mm-hmm.
and all this is so new that we're all learning,
Right.
and the
Right.
learning is part of the growth process that gets us to where we eventually want to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's so true for so many things. Understanding equals acceptance, and sometimes people do just want to understand things before they can really accept them, for better or worse. I just want to pick up on something you said earlier that I think is also can be challenging in this situation, and I find it personally challenging. Is that what is offensive to one First Nations person isn't offensive to another, perhaps. And as you said, it's a very everyone is different. Indigenous culture across Canada is varied, which is wonderful. But I also wonder if that can be confusing for people. And so, what would you say to someone who asked about that?
I would just say, even though there's a distinct difference between many Indigenous cultures, that the act of appropriation is universally accepted as like a defined act, a defined term.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you're dealing with elements from the Inuit culture, which is very common, because the Inukshuk, the kayak even is from
Yeah.
the Inuit culture, or the Cree culture, or the Haida culture, which is one of the Northwest Pacific cultures that where the totem pole originates from. There's all these different elements from all these different Indigenous cultures, but the act of appropriation, and how I have come to understand it is universally the same thing. So no matter what culture you're using elements from, it's all appropriation, no matter where no matter what culture. It's not also, I should say too, it's not just relegated to only Indigenous culture.
Certainly not. Yeah.
I think that's an important point, is that, we've seen appropriation occur from, the Black community, the Asian community, all of these different marginalized groups that have these really beautiful traditions, beautiful regalia, whatever it might be, just borrowed without thought, just kind of as though they are there for free use. And
Right.
I think that's an important point too. And I talk about that as well with my books and what I try to accomplish with them as well in terms of representation. It's not just representing Indigenous people when we talk about these things. It's representing any marginalized group.
Yeah. So another thing you said in the article, and I was kind of surprised in a sense, is that people actually ask you, what's the big deal about this? And I mean, I guess it's hard. I always think about, as a white woman, I have been so shielded from the realities and the extent of racism in our country for so long. So I'm kind of learning as I dig into this more that the stakes are high. And I'm surprised to hear people say to you, what's the big deal? Can you say a little bit more about that experience?
Well, I think that, like, for me, I found that over time, I don't get upset or angry about these things anymore, because I understand that there just needs to be some education that takes place, and it hasn't obviously taken place in these cases. One of the things I try to explain is that even though it seems like it's a small thing, like it's not that significant, because it's just someone's dressing up as Pocahontas, or someone's wearing a baseball cap from the Cleveland baseball team. I explained that these things are seeds that are planted, that grow, and they create an environment where it either shapes perceptions that we have of Indigenous people, or expectations that are grounded in falsities, and it can lead to beyond problematic things, but it can lead to dangerous things. One of the things that I think we're still dealing with today at a very significant level is the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so oftentimes you'll see still today and throughout history, this sexualization of Indigenous women. And it has led to, in areas and in times in history and today, this perception of Indigenous women that leads to violence.
No, and when you lay it out, the A to B, how you get from one spot to the other actually becomes pretty easy to see when you lay it out so clearly the way that you just did. And I think too, we say this all the time when we're talking at the magazine about how we move forward in a world that's, more focused on diversity and inclusion, a world that we very much want to be a part of. We always say, we're going to make mistakes, but when you know better, you do better. And I think that's part of what you're saying here too, is that education is so important. So I wanted to ask you on that point, what are some of the steps that cottagers can take, to rectify some of these sins that have come from the past and to move into the future in a more respectful and appreciative place when it comes to cultures that are not their own? Like, for example, the obvious question, can you put up that inukshuk on your shoreline that you have always put out there and you're quite fond of?
Right. It's a great question. And I love that saying, if you know better, you do better. A great example of what I feel the process looks like is at a restaurant in Clear Lake, which is a cottage area that I've been to every year since I was a kid. And an owner of a restaurant called The Wigwam, which I mentioned in the article, she when she bought out the business from her parents, immediately changed the name, because it always had bothered her. And that's the question part of it, right? So we talked about, people just having these lingering questions or doubts about whether or not something is right. She had that feeling, and so she educated herself about it. And when she realized that the name was appropriating from Indigenous culture, she made the switch to change the restaurant's name, and then also asked me if it was okay if she referenced the history of the restaurant on the wall that she was planning, this kind of heritage wall with pictures of it. So she did all the right things, and she even incorporated land acknowledgements in her menu and on the website. And so, I think what we need to do is, when you have those questions, is first of all to do some research, and just it could be as simple as going out onto the right sites on Google and reading up about the things that you have a question about. It's not hard to find information about, for example, the Inukshuk. It's not hard to find out questions about the history of the kayak. And when we do that and we educate ourselves, then that's really a good first step.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I think I know that the vast majority of cottagers, they are trying to be respectful, and they do appreciate, and they just sometimes don't know how to go about it. So it's kind of a good place to end, actually, with what you're saying here is, ask the questions. Don't be afraid to get it wrong, but keep asking the questions, because when you know better, you do better. And that's really the solution.
Yeah. You know what? And don't be afraid of making mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. If we're doing things with a good heart, and we're doing things in a good way, then a mistake is part of the learning process.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to say thank you for not just coming on our podcast, but thank you for all of the work that you do in educating people. I know it must be very difficult at times, but it's working. It's working for the team at Cottage Life and for our readers too, I think. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast today, David.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
For the June-July 2019 issue of Cottage Life, we asked several of our favorite contributors to share their thoughts on going wild at the cottage. Award-winning writer Clive Thompson had this experience to share about a magical journey into the woods. Walk into the Midnight Light is read by Pedro Mendez.
The image of the moonlight in the trees still haunts me. It was 1982. I was 13, and I was having a miserable time winter camping in the Boy Scouts. I'd been scouting since I was 6, and our troop would frequently head out for a weekend at a wooded piece of land owned by a friendly farmer near Lake Scugog, Ontario. But winter camping was a dodgy affair, because our troop had wretched gear, a ragtag collection of moldy canvas tents, a tent heater that looked like it predated the First World War. I had a foam Snoopy-branded sleeping bag that probably wasn't rated for a cool summer evening, let alone sub-zero knee-deep snow. It'll toughen you up, my dad said cheerily. That was debatable, but we tried. We pitched the tent, and at bedtime huddled in the dark, shivering and trying to ignore our chattering teeth. After a couple of hours, we realized it was delusional to believe sleep would come. "Man, we're going to be awake until dawn," said one of my friends with a sigh. To kill time, we put our snowsuits back on and went for a midnight hike. The moon was full, so bright we didn't need flashlights. We plunged into a thick stand of fir trees, crunching quietly along the bed of dry needles for 10 minutes, until we reached the edge of the firs and stumbled, suddenly, into the open. We'd reached a huge field, blanketed with snow, and across from us stood a stand of hundreds of white birch trees. That sight was supernatural, so eerie it sticks with me even today. The slender, bare birch shone in the night like dry bones. The moon loomed low over the forest, the bed of snow a pale piece of paper, crisscrossed with the ink-black moon shadows of the birch. It was as if we'd stepped into one of Lauren Harris's luminous and unsettling paintings, the landscape aglow with a weird and radiant spirit, like the idea of cold itself, white on white on white. It's not easy to strike dumb a group of jaded teens, but we stood there, staring for so long our feet went numb, utterly silent. These days, I live in Brooklyn, New York, which isn't a very wild place. I spend most of my time amidst screens and steel and subways. I like it that way. I'm an urban creature, and big cities are just collections of small neighborhood villages, a riot of society. But whenever I get a chance to dive back into the forests of Ontario, I take it, greedily, instantly. I go for long hikes, plunging into the woods, even in the freezing depths of winter. I think that almost 40 years later, I'm still chasing the spooky, almost alien beauty of that midnight scene. I want to be dragged out of myself in the way wilderness drags you. That's why it's so important to have these encounters with the woods when you're young, even when, perhaps especially when, you're physically miserable and just trying to endure it. The forest enters you like a ghost and never leaves.
Hey, cottage coach Adam Holman here. You know, some cottagers are all about the view. Me? I embrace the smells. Whether it's the scent of conifers after a good rain, the Canadian bacon on my cast iron skillet, or the mist off the lake when I'm out for an early morning paddle. That's why I like to use off, DEET-free mosquito repellent during my outings. It isn't greasy or oily like some other repellents, and it's odor-free, so I can enjoy every breath when I'm outdoors. Plus, it works well over my clothes, and because it's safe to use around plastics, I don't have to worry about my gear. So I can focus on the smells of nature without hearing the sounds of mosquitoes when I'm in the woods.
Cottage Life is well known for offering our readers little tips and hacks that make life at the lake a little bit easier. In this episode of the podcast, we help you out of a particularly sticky situation. What to do when you find a leech on your body after a swim. So the first thing that most cottagers will do is they'll douse the leech in salt. This will indeed work because a leech absorbs chemicals through its body, so coating it in almost anything will irritate it enough to make it let go. But this strategy isn't really much fun for the leech, and it can even kill it. And you don't want to do that, because many of the 60 species in Canada love to eat mosquito larvae in substantial quantities. So try this equally effective and much kinder solution. Submerge your limb in water and then use your fingernail to gently break the suction of each sucker. This method is a bit more hands-on than using the salt and a bit more gross, but you won't have to work too hard to make the leech let go. It really won't take much, and then you're good. And the leech is good. So everyone wins, except for the mosquitoes. That's it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening. Please subscribe to the Cottage Life Podcast for free wherever you get your podcasts. We'll have new episodes every Thursday throughout the summer, just in time for your drive to the lake. This episode is sponsored by our Cottage Life paid subscribers. I want to thank them for making this series possible. For new listeners, I invite you to check out our free email newsletters. Visit cottagelife.com/newsletter to sign up. We'd love to hear from you. Post a review or email us at cottagelife.com. To find out more about our magazine, our television shows, and our live events, visit cottagelife.com. This podcast is produced by Catherine Junn and me, Michelle Kelly. I'll see you on the dock.